All right. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Language Diary, and we're going to be doing something fairly exciting today. As you guys can see, we're going to be changing the format a little bit because the topic is a little bit too involved for me to actually just talk on camera. I'm going to be using a presentation to use as cues to help me kind of present this topic somewhat clearly. Anyway, let's dive right in. So as you can see with the title, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing a four-way comparison, excuse me, between the four Asian languages I'm somewhat familiar with: Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, and Korean. Before we get started, quick tangent as usual, if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, I would highly encourage you to do so, and it would mean a lot for the channel and for me. Just hit the subscribe button underneath the video if you're on YouTube, and also don't forget to hit the bell button after you've hit the, excuse me, the subscribe button. A lot of people apparently do not know the bell button exists. Okay, continuing. So what I'm going to be specifically talking about is which of the four languages do I think is the most difficult. And before I kind of reveal my answer at the end of the presentation, I would love to hear what you guys think. So take a guess and let me know in the comments below. Just say it's, I don't know, Mandarin or Korean or Japanese or Cantonese. Yeah, so that is that. And in particular, I would like to focus just on one aspect of these four skills when doing that comparison. As I'm going to be recapping a little bit of the first episode when I talked a little bit about listening in particular. That's what we're going to focus on. Each of these four skills come with its own set of difficulties, right? For example, reading. For reading, you need a certain vocabulary level and structures in order to understand what's going on. For writing, you need to have clarity in terms of what you think, you need to have coherence, and you need to be able to mimic, okay, what you read. You don't want to reinvent the wheel, you just want to copy and reuse. Okay? And for speaking, you need to be fast and you need to be able to think on your feet, right? Because it's instant, right? Someone talks to you, they expect you to respond instantly, and you need to be very good at circumlocution. So basically the art of expressing something sometimes complicated with the vocabulary that you might have, which might be limited in the beginning. And finally, we've got listening. You need to be able to, the challenge is you need to be able to concentrate well, and you need to be able to spot context clues very quickly in order to grasp what's going on. So I've always thought that listening is both the hardest skill and the most important skill to hone, but not because it's the hardest skill, right? They just happen to coincide in this case. Because with listening, if you can't catch something, right, when someone is speaking to you, you really can't catch it. People aren't going to repeat themselves, they're not going to wait. Native speakers will get impatient sometimes if you have to ask them to repeat it. So, in conclusion, grammar, vocabulary, reading, speaking, and writing, these are almost never the bottleneck in language learning. It's usually listening. So, that's what we're going to be doing a comparison of in between the four languages. And to start off with, I'm going to be presenting a couple of criteria to judge, how, like, in terms of what we're going to use to judge the difficulty of the listening in each of these four languages. So the four criteria would be, well, one of them is I'm going to split into two. Pronunciability, so how easy or hard it is to pronounce a certain language. The ability to transcribe to the writing system, so in other words, reversibility. Sound change rules. So for example, there's certain times when certain words come together and you need to change them, right? And the prevalence of that in each language. And clarity of speech, like a general sense of clarity among native speakers. So in order to do that, I prepared 4 clips. They're about 45 seconds each, and I'm going to be commenting on them as we go along. I hope the embedded videos work. I haven't actually done this a lot. So we're going to start off with Korean, and I'm just going to do a bit of a comparison. Don't worry if you don't speak these languages. I will slow down, and it'll all make sense, I promise. So we have this here, I believe, and you guys can kind of like follow along and you can read Hangul. If you can't, don't worry about it. So if you want to kind of watch this clip stand alone afterwards, you can always, excuse me, search for these videos online, and you can watch them again with the subtitles on and all that. Okay, here goes.
제가 이거 대본을 미리 좀 보다 보니까 스잔 씨가 요런 비슷한 상황 때문에 예전에 한번
So this example in particular, I would say, was challenging because it's there was emphasis on it, right? And it was pronounced differently than it would normally be pronounced, which is just yoro, right? So difficulty there.
오슈리한테 한번 마음 상한 적 있다고. 지금도 비슷한
Another one, 상한 적 있다고. So this again, it presents some difficulties because it's when you pronounce this individually, we have 상, 한, 적. But when you actually combine them, it becomes 상한 적, which means to get hurt, right? Or to hurt, I should say. So in other words, there's actually a linkage between these words, which makes it difficult to kind of like reverse it. And tok becomes tok. It goes into like a vowel, an aspirated vowel sound to a non-aspirated sound when it's not at the forefront position, or pronounced individually, I guess. So there's just to kind of like give context. In Korean, if there's certain sounds, like for example this, which is equivalent to kind of like a J sound in English, if it's put at the first, if it's the first kind of like unit of a word, then it's pronounced as a ch, like a ch sound in English, as opposed to a J, right? So there are some of these things that make it difficult. Continuing.
같긴 하거든요.
너무 낚이는 동생인데 맞습니다.
맞아요.
And this one again, something I had difficulty reversing, like capturing. It's if you'll hear, go back, slow down a little bit. It's 네 낚이한 동생인데요. So I actually thought that it was 낚이한 was actually one thing, but it's actually 낚이한, which means like a very important something something. And so the splitting isn't always obvious in Korean.
어떤 거죠?
이 얘기를 해야 되나 진짜.
해야죠. 해봐요.
And here, 얘기를 해야 되나 and then something. So when people trail off, okay, this isn't actually, I could hear it because he was trailing off, kind of like thinking about something, right? So didn't finish that sentence, I guess. Things like these, very difficult.
밖에서 만나.
네, 형은 기억이 잘 안 나겠지만 제가 처음으로 이제 작년에 같이 예능을 나갔었거든요.
근데요.
Ah, there you go. There's another one. It's when this is pronounced like normally it's just like 예능, right? But he literally just almost skipped over the first sound and had to go back, I think, once to actually capture that.
근데 그때 이제 같은 대기실을 쓰게 됐는데.
And I think this was almost like skimmed over. It's 그때 이제, this was almost silent. I think you just infer it from context, right? So there are certain things that you miss that connect, but they're actually there, right? So to go from non-existent to existent, that was challenging, I think, to hear.
아무래도 처음 봤으니까 선배님 잘 부탁드립니다. 제가 예능 처음이라 막 너무 떨리고 좀 많이 도와주세요 막 했는데
Okay, so that is Korean. Hopefully that's an interesting clip, and we will continue with our
외국인
analysis of Japanese. So these are kind of like fairly well, they're not very similar clips in terms of what they're talking about, but yeah, they're kind of like talk show-ish or later on just like an interview or something like that. So continuing with Japanese. So there's certain things in Japanese like they can be very quick, and these are kind of like you have to be very alert because like you know when a presenter, for example, is announcing something like preempting another segment of the show, right? They just want to kind of like get the introduction like speech over. that prefaces that next segment, right? So they oftentimes you'll hear that these things in talk shows, they're very, very quick. You have to pay extra attention to get these. So for example, それでは that's quick. はい、早速今夜のテーマに入りましょう。テーマに入りましょう。So that テーマに was also very quick, so you have to pay extra attention.
ましょう。今夜のテーマはこちら。日中間ペットが一番幸せに暮らせる国はどこ？
幸せ also becomes 幸せ that's also quick, right?
さあどこなんでしょうかね。まあ何でも日本だけじゃなくて中国、韓国でもね今なんかペットブームなんだ。そうです。それでは3カ国のペット事情 VTR にまとめました。ご覧ください。
So, それでは3カ国のペット勝負 VTR まとめましょう. So the まとめましょう was also a little bit quick. Actually, the first time I heard it, I thought I heard mimasho, but then it was actually matomemasho, which was almost like condensed because the in between sounds were almost like very, very quick and glossed over.
インドが生んだ偉大なる思想家ガンジーはかつてこんな言葉を残している。国の偉大さ、道徳的発展はその国における動物の扱い方でわかる。
なるほど、さすがガンジー。
ということで、and you almost hear that when it's fairly like the when they're quoting Ganji. That's right. They were. I'm sorry. So when they're quoting, for example, when they're reading something, the narrator is very clear. He was also a little bit slower, so you can get kind of different styles of speaking.
今回はペットの王様、犬に注目し、日中間のペット愛を比較してみよう。
Also, the narrator there was fairly clear when speaking as well. So, let's see. That is Japanese. So you often hear that fixed phrases like these they're often like uttered very quickly. You have to pay extra attention to get them. But if you know these in advance, they should be okay.
677万
Okay, moving on. Mandarin we have.
没有碰到过，
对对对，
那都是很远打个招呼。
来吧，咱们进入节目，实问实答
好，
啊，短平快。
我可以不回答的吗？
And the one challenge in Mandarin would be phrases like these. They're not actually like, they're kind of made up-ish, right? They exist as, these are three adjectives, 短平快. But if you have to like just listen to it and know that it's 短平快 in real time, that can be hard as well. And there's quite a lot of I think internet slang and all that in Mandarin.
可以，最近在忙什么？
我刚拍完那个我们来了
啊，就那个真人秀嘛。对了，第二个问题来了，好长时间不拍。
And there are things that are glossed over, like in Japanese, right? Very quickly. 就那个 instead of 就那个, right? So that you have to be careful when listening to stuff like that as well in Chinese.
电影了，也不拍电视剧了，怎么突然答应要参加真人秀了？
So when, yeah, there are certain bits no, 怎么突然答应又参加真人秀了呢？怎么突然答应又? So when these things are glossed over, that can make it, they're just like accelerated, right? Can make it difficult to listen.
其实我好长时间不拍电影是一个谣传。
And you'll hear that they actually speak fairly differently, right? She's Dongbei. She's actually from, she speaks a dialect, or actually in an accent of Mandarin that's a little bit closer to the Beijing dialect, or the Beijing accent, if you want to call it that. And so it's a little bit different than how she speaks. She's from Hong Kong, so her accent would be more like a southerner, so it sounds a little bit flatter, and she speaks a little slower, right? So her Mandarin would be easier to understand than hers, but hers is actually fairly standard.
我每年都在拍，我每年都在工作，
都在拍。
对，我基本上每年都有一部电影，
一部电影的，
或者是演个话剧而已。
其实你给你自己定位还是电影演员。
And then there's this very, very quick things. So for example, 还是 in a question can actually mean or it can actually mean still, right? When I first heard of it, I took it to mean or. but then there's no choice, right? So it has to mean still. So the great thing about Chinese segments or programs is that there's always these subtitles that are there, right? So you can follow along. So 其实你给你自己定位还是电影演员 it suddenly became 你给你自己定位还是电影演员 so that when you speed up like that it makes it very very difficult, right? But I guess that's the same across all languages.
当然，
今年拍什么电影了？
今年本来拍徐克的《通天帝国》武则天嘛，
Names, I think in Chinese in particular, are very hard to reverse. Even there's no way to tell what a name is. Actually, I read an article before. The reason that Chinese, one of the reasons that Chinese programs have subtitles, you never see that in any other language. Never. And I've never seen it for French, for Spanish, for Japanese, for Korean. Never. Only for Chinese. It's because it's impossible to reverse like the specific characters of names unless you knew it beforehand. Like Wu Zetian is a very famous, I think, queen in Chinese history, so people would know that, right? But unless you have that context, you wouldn't know it.
结果他delay 了。
往后延迟了，
对对
延迟了。
对，
哎，你和
All right, so that's Mandarin. You'll hear that Hong Kong people do tend to change between code shift, code switch, right, between languages as well. So there's that as well. Okay, moving on. And finally, we have a quick clip in Cantonese.
我諗會嚇親咯，如果唔係。咁我覺得冇乜特別，即係只係佢一個方法啫。
So 即係只係佢一個方法啫。So instead of 即係只係佢一個方法啫。So there are these things that are always like sped up, right?
可能 speed dating 都係一個。
And then you'll hear that 即係可能 turns into 即係可能 it was almost like abbreviated into one sound.
方法嚟嘅，即係亦都可能有機會有啲人唔睇好，咁可能又去夜蒲都可能係一個方法。我都。
So there's the 可能 often gets at the very least by the speaker, right? It turns into 可能。
我識好多係夜蒲一齊係啊結婚。
And the thing that's difficult about Cantonese is that they often jump, right? So for example here, 我都有識好多係夜蒲一齊係啦結婚。So I know lots who like hang out at night. Yes, marriage. So what he meant to say was, I know a lot of friends who like hanging out at night during nighttime. Have like a nightlife kind of thing. And then afterwards, after seeing each other for a while, they end up getting married. And you'll often find that this in-between progression is just completely left out. It's just implied, right? That's one of the difficulties of listening in Cantonese.
6年前仲未有太多人認識交友程式。當時25歲嘅 Charity 同拍咗拖8年嘅男朋友分手，心情好低落。
Again, narrator, like in Japanese, very, very clear. There's no way you can miss even a single sound, right?
即係因為我可能係一個好想要家庭嘅一個人，咁所以嗰陣時係覺得即係又冇得好急得嚟啦，咁又冇得強求，但係嗰個人喺邊度咧？即係咁樣。
So 即係 is actually one of the more common contractions, so you're gonna have to get used to that if you're learning Cantonese. 嗰個人 becomes 嗰個人. So there's certain things like that. I think that you need to be aware, but there aren't a lot of these in Cantonese. I think you'll come to find in comparison to I think, for example, Korean. And female speakers do tend to speak very clearly in Cantonese as well. So I mean that isn't to say everyone does, but certain people, the majority of female speakers, I think, tend to speak clearly, just in my experience at the very least. All right, moving on. So after looking at these clips and doing like a bit of a quick analysis on them, I realized it's not a very good entire representation, but we have some common difficulties that are existent, I think, in any language. For example, when you have overlapping voices, it's difficult, right? even if you want to focus on one voice, somebody's talking over another person. You can't listen, even if you are a native speaker. Second of all, quiet sounds. So how people, like, for example, they start talking very quickly, like very loudly, and suddenly they go, yeah, nothing like that. So we're, I don't know, let me think of an example. Yeah, so he was at the party last time, and we kind of like, yeah, just we kind of had a couple of drinks, and yeah. And so when you kind of trail off, your voice suddenly goes quiet. In each language, irrespective of language, that's difficult to get, right? When people trail off. So influence from dialects, that's very difficult to work around as well, because when we learn, we often learn as a foreign language learner the standard dialect, right? When you have different dialects, then it stands to reason that we're not going to be able to just get used to it immediately. Mid-sentence changes are difficult as well. So if you were trying to say something and then you switched, then it almost seems like it doesn't make any sense, because it's not supposed to kind of like connect together, these two phrases. But afterwards, when you change your mind in terms of what you want to say, then that creates something that's difficult to interpret, right? Fixed phrases uttered very rapidly. We saw that with Japanese. And let's see. So if we have, we saw that with Japanese. We saw that with Mandarin in particular. And then we have made-up phrases. So as I explained earlier, with something like, 短平快, right? That's not something standard, right? So when you hear stuff like that, it's almost impossible to understand, like, on your first listen. Names are difficult to listen to in any language. That's common. And you slur, right? When speakers slur, it's hard to listen to, right? So these are some common difficulties. So let's do kind of like a comparison based on what we have seen so far, based on these kind of criteria. We're just going to fill this chart in bit by bit. Sorry, it's taking a little bit long, but as we know, a bit of content today. So moving on. First of all, we have pronunciability. And before we dive into it, let me just show you a couple of things. For Korean, for example, you can kind of like get this chart. So some people, when they see, oh, so you can actually map all the sounds in Korean, on a chart. That's not actually true. These are all the sounds that you can make by combining these, which are consonants, and these, which are vowels. But there are also like final sounds. And in other words, you can actually combine these things, all of these, with these. So that actually makes quite a lot of combinations, right? So these are the all the possible combinations that you can have in Korean. And just to kind of like a quick breakdown of Korean, for those of you who are not familiar with the language. When writing Korean, the system, Hangul, right, it's split up into vowels, and consonants, right? One unit of word in Korean, it can be made up of 2, 3, or up to 4 consonant and vowel combinations, right? And these are all the possible combinations of these consonants, vowels, and consonants within each block. So as you can imagine, there's actually quite a few variations that's possible in Korean. Moving on, Japanese. Japanese, this is it. These are all the sounds that you can make in Japanese. So in terms of pronunciability, very, very pronunciable. Not just because there's few sounds. All of these sounds are almost a subset of what you can say in English. So if you can speak English, you can definitely pronounce Japanese. Whereas with Korean, there's certain sounds that are not too straightforward. Continuing with Chinese as well, all of these sounds are almost, I'm not going to say they're the same, they're as pronunciable as Japanese, but they can be mapped out, right? And generally, once you have the basics down, this is all the sounds that you have. So very doable. There's a bit of a learning curve in the beginning, but very doable. And there are similar with Cantonese. So we can see that we have the Yuping chart in Cantonese at Canton Lounge. So it makes it very, once again, pronounceable after you've gone over the initial learning curve. There are obviously no tones that kind of add an extra layer of complexity, but again, nothing that can't be overcome with a little bit of practice. So to start off with, I'm going to say that Korean is the hardest, Japanese is the easiest, and Mandarin and Cantonese are somewhere in between. Because for Korean, they're the hardest because there are certain sounds that are not very intuitive for speakers of any other languages. There's some, for example, the R sounds are difficult to pronounce. There's some challenging sounds that aren't intuitive. For example, dui. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means brain, right? It's like if you look at the romanization, it just doesn't make sense. You're gonna have to ask. And when it's pronounced in context in a sentence, it changes, right? So that makes Korean hard. Japanese is easy because pretty much in any context, standalone, or if it's pronounced in a sentence, a paragraph, it's the same. Mandarin and Cantonese are similar, except their tones, so I gave it a 2. Next, we have sound reversibility. So I'm going to kind of split reversibility into 2 categories, just sound and script. So reversibility back to sound, right? I'm going to give these languages, they're all not very difficult. And the reason I give, so what is sound reversibility? What do I mean by that? First of all, sound reversibility is the ability to reverse what you hear back to the atomic sounds. So for example, that you can kind of like spell them out for an English speaker. For example, you hear we in Korean. That's kind of like W-A-E, right? But there are certain ambiguities in Korean that make this reversibility a little bit lower. So there's we and there's we, which almost sound the same when uttered very quickly as part of a sentence, which makes it a little bit difficult to reverse it to that atomic unit. Whereas there's no such problem in Japanese, Mandarin, and Cantonese. For example, you hear, I don't know, hikakusuru. That's just hi, kaku, kaku, and then suru, su, and then ru. So because there's so like, it's one block of text, one block of sound individually pronounced. You don't get that problem. Korean also has a problem of linking sounds over. So the example I gave when we were looking over that clip, 상한 tok becomes 상한 tok, which again just reduces, I guess, the reversibility a little bit. Not in terms of sound, I guess, but script to a certain extent. Which brings us, Mandarin and Cantonese are very similar to Japanese, except I guess you have tones, but it's not too hard. In Mandarin, there's like 1 out of 4, and in Cantonese, you have 1 out of 6. So, which brings us to our next point, script reversibility. So what do I mean by that? I mean reversibility in terms of what you hear and how easily you can just transcribe that back into the script. For example, Hangul in Korean, hiragana in Japanese, and of course characters. And of course, it would stand to reason that any language that has characters is hard because you have to remember the character, right? Even if you type it, if you don't know that character, you just don't know it, right? And one sound, for example, in Mandarin, ch, that can match to so many characters, right? So it's not very reversible at all. And the reason I bring reversibility up is if you can't reverse something, then you can't check it up in the dictionary. Like when you hear something, you want to know what that word means. Well, I don't know how to input it in the dictionary even, so what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to check it up? So it kind of like becomes a case of I have to read enough to gain enough vocabulary in order to actually understand what people are saying and just ignore words I don't understand when listening, which is not an ideal situation, right? But that's the nature of the language. Next, we have sound. Okay, and I guess I should talk about Korean as well in particular. The reason Korean is a little bit lower is because of its absence of characters, but its reversibility is still a little bit complex. It's not one, even though it uses kind of like an alphabet writing system. The reason it's not one is because, once again, there are sound change rules, there are ambiguities that make it difficult to reverse. For example, there's padak versus padak. They sound exactly the same, but I will assure you they're actually different things. And you have to get context, right, in order to distinguish them, and you have to know these words in advance. But unless you do, it's very difficult to, like, if I just set that word individually, it's very difficult to know which version of padak I'm talking about, right? Floor, or is it the chicken version? Okay, moving on. Sound change. For sound change, I'm still going to go with Korean as the most difficult, and Mandarin as medium difficulty, but only for like just one very small reason. Whereas Japanese and Cantonese are like easy. And the reason I'm giving these languages the respective relative scores would be Korean, there are definitely advanced sound change rules. For example, when you have a unit that's composed of 4 like vowels and consonants, they are there are certain silent sounds in between, and that I would consider to be a sound change because you're not pronouncing that, right? For example, ikta, which means to read. If you hear it, you might just hear there's the ig, right? If we were to kind of like Romanize it, but there's actually a silent r in between. You can't hear it, right? So that makes reversibility hard, and it makes pronouncing hard. And there are things like, for example, 식품, which means food product. That when you pronounce it as a word, it actually becomes 식품, just because it's easier to pronounce. And there's certain rules like that, which changes the official way that you're supposed to pronounce these words. Mandarin, I'm kind of like putting that in there, not because it has changes in terms of how it's pronounced, but there are tone changes. So when you put 2 third tones in Mandarin together, the first one changes to a second one. And it gets further complicated by the fact when you have consecutive third tones, like 3 third tones, 4 third tones, 5 third tones together, then it's not always clear how you would change the tones for that. So I'm going to just give it a 2 for that reason. As far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, there are no sound change rules in Japanese and Cantonese, so they get 1 each. And last but not least, we have clarity of speech. And all of them generally, speakers of each these respective languages, they tend to be fairly clear. But I'm going to give Korean and Mandarin just a little bit of a higher score, more difficult score, because Korean speakers, just because of the nature of the language, when they speak very quickly, the clarity is lost very easily. And with Mandarin, I gave it a slightly higher score for a different reason. There are people who are still heavily influenced by their local dialects, which make it very heavily accented Mandarin. And I've actually had that experience of being for example, in Shanghai and hearing people, and I didn't understand them just because of their very heavy accents, right? You don't get that very often with Japanese and Cantonese. Like there's the Kansai Ben in Japanese, but it's something you can get used to very, very quickly. It's not like a completely different language where it's not mutually unintelligible. It's just kind of like emphasizing certain parts of speech a different way. Like the intonation is different with Kansai Ben than it is with like the standard Tokyo dialect, right? And Cantonese, I've just never had any problems with that. All right, so adding the scores up, here's the answer, guys. The most difficult for me, this is all very subjective, obviously. For me, Korean is the hardest. Mandarin and Cantonese are kind of in between, and Japanese is, without the single hint of a doubt, it is the easiest in terms of listening. So that's my conclusion. Hardest Korean, once again, easiest Japanese. So does that match with the answers that the guesses you guys had in the beginning of the video? Anyway, as usual, this isn't really like a language challenge per se, but I kind of like wanted to give you guys a bit of a comparison to share some of the experiences I've had in learning these 4 languages. And hopefully that was helpful. And if you want to see like a transcript version of this, you can always go to this link, a little bit long this time, I know, and read it instead. So that's about it for today. Thank you so much. I'm sorry that this got a little bit longer than usual, but I wanted to do this video for such a long time that, I think I'm going to make an exception. So I would really appreciate it, last of all, if you would give it a thumbs up if you found it helpful or interesting somewhat. And if you, as usual, have any questions or comments, very welcome to leave them below. I will do my best to get back at you. Get back to you, sorry, which I usually do. All right, thank you once again, and I will see you guys next time. Cheers.